Hey everybody, and welcome to the Auto Landscape Material tutorial for the Procedural Foliage Placement tool. In this video, we're going to go over several things. First, we're going to create a brand new map, and we're going to import a height map to create that sample level that I showed in the previous video. We're going to then apply the landscape material that's included, and we're going to take a look at the different options that come with that material. Things like what are the material parameters that you can tweak to look at the different heights and how the different layers blend. We're going to look at the different paint layers, because not only is it a auto material that blends layers by height and slope, you also have additional layers to create clearings, paths, etc., or even take out some of the foliage. And then we're going to take a look at specific foliage settings like the grass and the rocks and the little ferns that spawn automatically. And we're going to finish everything by looking at how you can quickly create several different material instances for different levels, right, to keep your settings. So let's go ahead and jump to Unreal. And if you were following from the previous video, you'll notice that this is exactly where I left off. I'm kind of doing these videos back to back. So the first thing we'll do is we want to create a brand new level. So let's go ahead and go to File, New Level, and click on Default. And you should be right here. So we're going to delete the floor. We can go ahead and delete the reflection capture. Go to the light source and change it to movable. That way we don't have to build lighting. Go to the skylight and change it to movable. That way you get that little message out that says lighting needs to be rebuilt. I'm going to select all of these options here, right click and go to Move To, Create New Folder. I always like to do that to keep things organized. And I name them Components. You don't have to do that, but I like to keep everything real tight. Okay, and then what we're going to do, let's go ahead and save selected, go to PFT, Maps, and let's just call this, I'm just gonna call it Demo, Level Demo. Call it whatever you want. This is just for a tutorial specifically, okay? Once we've done that, we want to go ahead and create our landscape. Now you can create anything you want, but because I already have the height map included here as part of the project, I figured that why not use it, right? So go ahead and click on the landscape icon here. And if you zoom out, you'll see that it automatically tries to create a landscape here. But instead of doing create new, we're going to say import from file, right? And it's going to ask you to select a specific height map file. So if you click on the little icon here, it'll actually open the project, and you should see that it depends on where your desktop is, but in my case it already opened inside the project, right? So if it's not there, navigate to wherever you saved your project, and that would be Procedural Foliage tool, right? This is what you should see. Go to Content, PFT, go into Textures, and right at the bottom you should see a PNG file called tshowcase1hm. That stands for height map. You can see it's a pretty big file. Click on Open, and you'll see how Unreal gives you a low poly version of what that height map looks like. And you can see it right here. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. You can see that there's a location, there's a rotation, and there's a scale. For whatever reason, and this happens all the time with height maps, the Z scale is usually exaggerated. So for the showcase, I think I picked something like 50%. So for this example, I'm going to just pick 50, just to make sure that it's not as exaggerated, right? And you can see here, it's a pretty big landscape. You don't have to have it so extreme. So you know what? Let's make it a little bit better. Let's make it 75. And the reason for that is because we want to make sure that we have some really high areas so we can have some snow in it, and some low areas where we're going to have our river. So 100, 175, you don't have to mess around with these settings. We're going to leave them as they are. And for the material, we're going to select type terrain, and you'll see that two things pop up: the actual material called procedural terrain _ advanced, and the material instance procedural terrain advanced underscore standard. So go ahead and select the material instance, because that's the one that's going to allow us to change all of the parameters on the fly, right? Go ahead, and once you have that selected, select import, and we're going to give Unreal a couple of, hopefully not too long. I was going to say minutes, but hopefully not too long. And you can see that the landscape has been imported and is 100% black, right? And I see this all the time. People freak out. I used to do that until I understood. The reason for that is because we haven't specified the layers, right? So before you do anything else, go here and go to paint, and you'll see that this material actually has 4 different layers, and everything is set as none. So click on the little arrow here and select procedural layer info, and you'll see how this automatically kind of changes things. Then go into foliage removal, change this to the appropriate layer, custom foliage to custom foliage, and soil to soil. All right, and now if we go back to the place layer here, you'll see that our landscape is now textured, right? It looks very different from the other landscape on the showcase, and that is because the height of the landscape is different. So I believe for the other layer I had the height at 10,000. So go ahead and put 10,000 here on the Z value, and you'll see that now things have changed. And it's going to look a little different from the demo, again, because the Z scale that we had on the map is different. I think this is a little bit more exaggerated, but it doesn't really matter. The whole point is that you are now have a landscape, and you can see that this is automatically adding the landscape. So I'm gonna go ahead and just leave it as is for now. Okay. Now, if we go back to our little PowerPoint slide here, just to keep us honest, we've gone ahead and created a new level, and we've imported our height map, and we've assigned the material. So now let's take a look at the material parameters that we have here, right? There's a lot of sand here, right? A little too sandy. So actually, maybe because of the scale, maybe we should move this a little bit higher. So let's just try 15,000 here instead of the 10,000 here on the Z. And I think that makes it a little bit better. And we can change those parameters, but I think I'm gonna leave it there. So make sure that the location of X and Y, don't touch it. They're correct, but the Z value here is 15,000 for the material here. And now when you click the landscape, go under landscape materials, and click on this little icon here to locate the material in the content browser. And this is the material instance. So we're going to go ahead and open the material instance, and I'm going to make this smaller so we can see the changes. And let's take a look at some of the parameters that we have here. If I zoom in here, right, on the editor, you'll see that we have, let me just make this a little bit smaller here. You'll see that we have some foliage spawning, right? If we go here to the sand layer, you see that we have some rocks that are spawning. And if we go to the really top of the mountains, you see that we have some ferns that seem to be, that seem to be frozen. So right there, you see that every significant layer has some foliage that's being spawned. So the first thing when you look at the parameters group is under foliage, you're going to see a bunch of different settings for the foliage that spawns automatically in your landscape. So the first one, well, actually, let's just take it one step at a time. Grass factor is going to be the first one, and you see it as 5, right? If you untick that, and this goes to the default of 1, you'll see that there's a lot less grass that spawns, right? And if I'm gonna go ahead and click on play, and you guys see that the grass that spawns is very sparse, and I kept it like that on purpose for performance reasons, right? I have a pretty decent machine. I have a 1070, so in my machine I can have a lot of foliage, but the default spread of foliage is very sparse, as you can see here. That's just little patches. So if you want more foliage, right, if you want more grass, you can go ahead and activate this grass factor. And by default, I have it at 5, and you can see that there's a lot more, but you can change this number to whatever, right? So you can see here that this is a 5, you still have some patches. You can change this to something like a 10, right? And you can see that a lot more grass is then spawned. Oops. Right, you can change this to like a 20, right? Obviously, just be aware that there's going to be a limit, right, as far as performance. The more grass you have, obviously the more performance heavy it'll be. There is another way of changing this, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But just by the material parameters here, you can change the factor, the growth factor of specific foliage. The same thing for the rocks here. You see that the sand foliage factor is 0.1, right? I don't want that many rocks spawning. So if I change this to 1, you'll see that there's a lot more rocks that are spawning, right? Little sandy rocks. So in my case, for my demo, I didn't want it to be like this. But you can have this, you want a lot of rocks, you can change this to like a 10, and you'll see that there is a lot in your sand. So this gives you a level of control, obviously, on how many, how many entities are spawned on each individual layer. So I'm gonna go back and put this at 0.1, that's only 10. Just because I personally don't like my beach or my sand to have that many rocks. And the same thing can be said, obviously, for the snow, right? So I have these little ferns here that are spawning with a little material that looks like they're frozen. And again, this is only 0.25. So same thing, you can make you can make the frozen area have a bunch of these ferns, right? Based on the number that you have here. You won't put 100 here, you have a lot more of these, right? So it's up to you to control how many meshes are spawned on the different layers just by changing the numbers here. And this is why I said having the material instance selected instead of the material allows you to do this very, very nicely. There's also the blend smoothness here. I'm going to the parameters here. And this basically defines how smooth is the transition between one layer to another. So if I take this off, and it's a little hard to see in this area here, but look at the line here, for example, between the grass and the sand. If I add smoothness, you see how the sand goes a little bit higher, right? The blend is higher. Look at that, how this is much more harsh. And as soon as I select blend smoothness and I add it and I increase it to about 200, there's this additional area here where it's just smoothly transitioning. So you can play with this factor here. The end slope blend and the beginning and the start slope blend basically allows you to control what is the slope where the rock layer will appear and when it will end, right? So if you put this at, let's say, 0.5, you'll see that almost, it has to be really steep, right, for the rocks to appear. If you increase this number to, like, I think it was 0.75 what I had, you'll see that a lot more rock will appear. So you can control how much rock appears by changing this start slope blend and the end slope blend again. So let's make this something like 0.9, and you'll see that even more rock appears. So play around with this number. It's a little hard to explain. 0.95, for example, right? It gives you even more rock. So go ahead and play with these numbers here, end slope and start slope. I'm going to leave it at the default, 0.65, actually 0.75 is probably better here, and 0.8 well, start slope at 0.75. Play around with these numbers until you get the look that you want. And then let's take a look at some other values here. The sand start height is at what height does the sand layer start, and the default is minus 1000 units, but you can make this anything you want. So if I change this to 0, you can see that the sand layer rises up. There's more sand. You can actually make this whatever you want. So 1000 units above, the sand rises up. So you can control or maybe you can make this like minus 5,000, right? And in this case, there is no sand, right? Because minus 5,000 in the world is even lower than the lowest point in this map. So play around with this value here once you have your landscape the way you want it. And this initial start value will define when does this value start, and then from there towards the bottom, that is when the sand will appear. And same thing for the snow, right? So snow start height, I have it by default at 10,000, but you can change this to whatever, maybe it's 15,000, right? And you can see how immediately the snow is changing to only 15,000. Or you can make this 5,000, which makes it a lot more snowy, right? So again, same thing, play around with these numbers. By default is 10,000. This is what looked best for my specific landscape for the demo, and this is why I made it the default. But the reason I'm showing you this is because you can change anything you want here, okay? And then texture tiling, not gonna spend too much time here, but basically this is, you know, how much do you want the individual textures to tile? You'll notice that there are some blotches here, and this is a technique that I picked up from one of the epic streams on landscapes. So this is not really as necessary. The tiling is already broken up for you by these little blotches that you see here. So it doesn't really look like it tiles that much. But if you change the tiling here, you can make it tile twice as much as 3 times or whatever. It'll basically make the texture smaller to tile more often. Or you can make it less, like 0.5, and it'll make the texture bigger. And then you have the textures themselves here. So obviously, I'm giving you a way of actually changing the textures. So if you have a better texture for grass, you can go ahead and activate the grass texture here. And in this case, it's just the same one, but you can change the texture here. And if you do that, make sure that you change the grass normal to match, and then it'll automatically change the texture here. Same thing for sand and rock and soil, which we'll look at the soil in just a second here. Okay, so those are the relevant parameters. Go ahead and save here and close. Another thing I did want to show is some of the paint layers. And if I go back to the tutorial here, slide, we looked at the material parameters. So let's take a look at the paint layers, right? So you saw this earlier, but let's just take a quick look here. So I'm going to go ahead and go in here into one of the foliage areas, click on the landscape tab, go to paint, and you'll see that we have 4 different layers. The main layer is the procedural layer. This is what's being applied right now. So there's nothing for you to do here. This layer basically applies the textures with the slope and the height blend. But you have a foliage removal layer, and if you select it, you'll see that as you paint, I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. There's no need to make it that big. As you paint, you create a little clearing on your landscape. You can see here. And this basically clears all of the foliage in that area. So if you want to make a little clearing in your landscape, you can just use this layer, or you can make like a little path. You can see here, and it'll just clear all of the grass and the flowers. The same thing can be said for any of the layers, right? If you click on Shift and Paint, it'll actually remove the layer. So this is like negative painting, right? So if you wanted to remove this layer, you can just hit Shift and paint over the area again, and you can see it's kind of removing it. And as soon as you let it go, it'll automatically paint this again. There's a custom foliage layer, and I'll show you how you customize that, but this is for you to add custom foliage. And in this case, I have this little rocks here, and you can put as many meshes as you want, or as little meshes as you want, and you can see here. So in this case, the sample is just rocks, and you can add these rocks anywhere you want, right? And you can see that we're adding rocks here. And the same thing, Shift Paint will remove the rocks from your layer. So we can just leave some rocks here. Why not? And then the last one is the soil layer. And this is similar to the foliage removal, but it actually has a texture. So if you wanted to have a little clearing, whoops, you can paint a little clearing patch here. And you can see this is more like soil. So if you wanted to have a little path in your forest, you can just kind of paint around. Let me change the fall off, make it a little bit bigger. You can see how you can have an additional layer here that you can paint on your landscape. And same thing, if you wanted to remove it, shift click and paint over, and you will then remove the area here. Okay. Okay, so those are the layers. And now let's take a quick look here at the material grass types folder. Right, so you can look at these folders here. These are the layers that we selected at the beginning. You don't need to touch this. These are the material functions used in the main material. You don't need to touch those. But you can go to the middle folder, grass types, and you can see there are several files here. And these are the files that have all of the details for what spawns on the landscape, right? So the first thing that here is the grass type underscore custom. And if you open it, I'm gonna make this, actually, I'm just gonna leave it like this. And you open grass variety, you see that we have these rocks, rock gravel. So these are the rocks that we spawned when we selected the custom layer to paint, right? So this layer here, custom foliage, is using this file here, right? And you can see if I shift click to remove the rocks are deleted. But you can change the density of what spawns here, either on the material parameters or on the grass density number here. So right now, if I do one click, you see these rocks, right? But if I click here and change this to, I don't know, 50, you'll see that a lot more rocks appear all of a sudden, right? So the number here combined with the number in the material instance will give you the density of the material of the spawned foliage here. Now keep in mind, anything in this grass types will not have collision, right? So if you wanted to use this method to spawn trees, they won't have collision. As far as I know, there is no way of using the grass node material, which is what we're using here, for collision, right? This is why it's so efficient, why you can have so much grass and keep your frame rate high. There is no collision. So big rocks, anything big, I will not add here. So stick to small little things that your player can walk through, or if it's like in the background and the player can't reach, then go ahead and do that, right? So this is the custom. Feel free to add. You can add as many varieties as you want, right? So this is just rocks, but you can add as many different varieties with different densities and scales, and it'll paint it with that layer, okay? Same thing if I click on flowers, you'll see that we have two different flower varieties. We have the buttercup and the field scabious, and they have the same density. But if you wanted to have, the buttercups are the yellow ones that you can see here. Oops. So if you wanted more yellow flowers, increase this density. If you wanted less white flowers, decrease the density here. Or you can add even the same, what I've seen, the same mesh with different scales to add even more variety in your landscape. So that's another little technique I picked up from one of the Epic streams. And actually I'm doing that right here. I'm using the same grass mesh, but I'm changing, I'm doing this grass mesh at 1, a scale 1 at 40, and this same mesh at scale 20, but at a range of between 3 and 4. And this is why you see some grass taller than another grass, right? So if I'm walking around in this area, you'll see that some grass is actually higher than the other grass, and that gives it a nice little variety. Makes the landscape look, you can see like in this case, you see this little patch of grass is taller than this little patch of grass here. So you can be creative here, and if you have other content that you've bought that has different types of grass, then here's where you would add it, right? All of the different little grass varieties that you want in your grass layer, make sure that you add it here. Okay, then you have the sand, and this is again what is used by the sand layer, and all I have here is the gravel, the rock gravel with the little sandy texture here. Grass density at 1, again, in my case, I'd rather not have that many rocks. You cannot go below 1, unfortunately, so I was trying to put something like 10% here. The lowest you can go here is 1, but if you want even less, use the material parameters to put a decimal place, like 0.1, like I have it here, and it'll actually work. And same thing for snow. I have this little fern here. So every single layer is using a different file here. You can customize the meshes. You can change the meshes by going here. You can change the density here, or you can go to the material instance here and change the levels here. And you can see I didn't touch on it, but you can see that the flowers have their own factor. The custom foliage has its own factor, and there's even a general spawn density factor that controls everything at the same time. So if you wanted a lot of everything, you can just disable all this and do spawn density, and this will actually affect everything that is spawned. All right, so I think we've talked long enough. So in this tutorial, we've imported the height map, we've added the tutorial, the included material. We've looked at the different layers, we've added the layers, we've looked at how we can paint the different layers. We looked at the material parameters, and we looked at the different foliage types that are found here and how to change them. So I think that'll cover it for this video. In the next video, we're actually and finally going to start looking at actual blueprints. We're going to start with the river tool, simply because it's simple and it lets us set up the scene here in this little area here. We're going to go ahead and put the river here, and then after that, we're finally going to look at actually placing some trees in your scene. So thank you guys so much. Again, if you have any questions, if something didn't work, leave me a comment on the YouTube video, or you saw my email at the very beginning here. Make sure you reach out if you have any specific questions, and I'll help you out. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next video.